All right, great. Well, thank you everyone for being here. I'd like to just start off by thanking the faculty and staff at Sloan for an amazing 6 years of learning and mentorship, and in particular, my advisor, Sinan Aral, and the other members of my dissertation committee. Today, I'm going to be talking about one of the chapters from my dissertation. This is work called the Engagement Diversity Connection, Evidence from a Field Experiment on Spotify. And this is joint work with a number of co-authors, many of whom are research scientists at Spotify, and then also my advisor. So the focus of this work is recommender systems or personalization. And particularly in the year 2021, these systems are ubiquitous. If you kind of look around the digital world, you'll see them everywhere. And I'm showing you here an example of a recommender system that I saw on a recent visit to Amazon, right? So using historical clickstream data, things that I have purchased, looked at, reviewed, Amazon is able to infer my preferences and recommend to me books that I might like to read. In this case, Amazon has intuited that I am a PhD student who studies statistics and data. I also like baseball. And so if you look at these books, you're sort of seeing a mixture of those topics represented in the set of books displayed to me. And previous research, and I also think people's just intuitive sense of how things work, suggests that the introduction of these systems tends to increase sales or increase engagement, not only for the particular items that are recommended, but also for a platform as a whole. The focus of this work is largely going to be what effect these systems have and increasing personalization has on the diversity of things that people consume. And I'm going to be talking about two different notions of diversity that I just want to sort of define here at the beginning of the talk. So the first is what I'm going to call individual level consumption diversity. This is really going to be a measure of how homogeneous or heterogeneous any one person's consumption is. I'm showing you here an example on the bottom left, which is the set of podcasts that a person listens to. I'm showing you podcasts here because this experiment is going to look at changes to the extent to which podcast recommendations are personalized. And so if you look at the set of podcasts that this person is listening to, and if you're at all familiar with podcasts, you'll see that these podcasts all cover similar topics, right? So these are all podcasts about tech, computers, the internet, things of that sort. And so this would be a person who has low individual level consumption diversity, since all these podcasts are quite similar in terms of the topics they cover. The second notion of diversity that I want to introduce is what I'm going to call population level consumption diversity. And so this is really going to be a measure of how different or similar different people are across the population. So to show you an example of what I mean here, in addition to that first person that I just showed you, I'm showing you a second person. If I look at the set of podcasts that they consume, these podcasts cover many different topics, right? So there are some about science fiction, some about true crime, some about law. And so not only would this be one person who has high individual level consumption diversity, since they're consuming a wide variety of topics, but if I look at this population of two, they're quite dissimilar in terms of what they consume. And so this would be a small population that has high population level consumption diversity, since the people consume different things. To give you a sense of previous work on this topic, there's of course a large literature on the technical aspects of recommender systems. So how do these systems work underneath the hood? How are these recommendations actually generated and then delivered to people? There's also, as I mentioned earlier, a large literature that looks at the effect that recommender systems have on sales or engagement. And they generally find that recommendations, whether they're human curated or algorithmically generated, do increase sales, not only for the particular item that's recommended, but generally for these platforms as a whole. Now, if you look at the effect of recommendations on diversity and what the previous literature has to say on that, there's not really a clear consensus. So if you look at the very early research on this topic, there are some that are arguing that increased personalization is going to sort of homogenize the internet and everyone will consume things that are very similar. Whereas there's others that argue that this is going to lead people into, separate, distinct niches that are very dissimilar. And if you look at more recent empirical research, you can sort of see results that point in both of these directions as well. A couple of recent works that I want to draw particular attention to are a recent sort of strain of field experiments that are looking explicitly at recommender systems or increased targeting on the internet and trying to understand how these systems do change the patterns of people's consumption. So similar to what I'm doing here. And then also recent research that's come specifically out of Spotify and is showing that changes in the consumption diversity of people on a platform actually have a correlation with people's long-term business outcomes, right? So whether or not they churn from a platform, whether or not they are monetized well by that platform. And so the work I'm going to show you today sort of, contributes to this literature by offering another field experiment that's trying to understand how these systems actually change people's diversity. And you can imagine that there's some value to accumulating a lot of empirical evidence on this topic, given that there are so many different degrees of freedom, right? So what is the business setting that we're studying? What are the nuts and bolts of the particular algorithm being used? What type of diversity do we even care about? Things of this sort. The research setting for this work is Spotify. I think most people have used Spotify at some point, but in case you are an Apple Music person or a Tidal person and you just don't know anything about the platform, Spotify was founded in 2006 as a music streaming company. And of relevance for this research, since I'm going to be talking about podcasts, in 2015, Spotify expanded their offerings to both videos and podcasts. Spotify is a large platform, right? So as of 2019, they have about 220 million monthly active users, and about half of them are paying subscribers for the service. And if I can just spend a second to convince you that podcasts are worth studying, and podcasts in particular on Spotify are worth studying, according to an Edison research study from 2019, about half of the US population has listened to at least one podcast, and about a third listen to podcasts on a monthly basis. Of that third that are monthly podcast listeners, about 40% have used Spotify at some point to listen to those podcasts. So the upshot here is that a lot of people listen to podcasts, and of those that do, many of them have at least tried listening to a podcast on Spotify at some point. Just to show you what podcasts on Spotify look like, this is what you'd see if you navigated to the podcast section of Spotify's desktop app. And the thing that I want to call your attention to here is that the podcasts on Spotify are assigned to these different categories. So things like educational, true crime, things of this sort. And these categories are going to be the dimension with respect to which we measure both individual level diversity and population level diversity. So when I say the podcasts that I listen to are becoming more or less diverse, I'm really saying, am I listening to a broader mixture of different, categories of podcasts, or am I really sort of doubling down on one or two particular categories, say true crime or comedy or something of that sort? In this study, we conducted an experiment on Spotify. And what the treatment intervention did is it changed the podcasts that were displayed to users in a particular section of the home section of Spotify's app called Podcast to Try. So to just kind of walk you through that briefly, I'm showing you over here a screenshot of the home section of Spotify's app. So on mobile, this is what you see when you first open up Spotify. And then Podcast to Try is one of these many carousels that are shown on this section of the app. And so each of these carousels is conceptually a collection of content that the customer might want to engage with. So if I listen to jazz a lot, there might be a carousel called Jazz Classics. Jump back in here is things that I've recently been listening to. And then Podcast to Try is one such carousel that is a set of podcasts that Spotify is recommending to the user. The experiment did not exogenously vary whether or not Podcast to Try was displayed or where in the ranking of carousels it showed up. What it's really changing is just the podcasts that were loaded into this carousel. And so in the control group, people were just recommended 10 popular podcasts based on their demographics. So not a very personalized experience at all. Whereas in the treatment group, users were recommended 10 podcasts based on a machine learning model. And what that model did is it used a combination of people's music listening history along with those same demographic attributes to try and predict the podcast that people were likely to follow. One thing that I want to note is that this is ultimately a pretty light touch treatment intervention. So once someone had streamed or subscribed to their first podcast during the experiment, Podcast to Try was no longer shown in the home section of the app. And so when I go through the results, which I'm going to show you in just a second, we're first going to look at the effect that these more personalized recommendations had on engagement, which is pretty in line with a lot of the existing research that I just mentioned. But then we're also going to look at how it changed the diversity of what people consumed. So the first result is that increased podcast personalization increased the amount of podcast streaming on Spotify. So both the unique number of podcast streamers and the number of podcast streams per user increased, both by a quite large amount, so about 30%. So personalizing these recommendations had a large, statistically significant impact on the amount of podcast streaming. The second thing that we look at is the change in the individual level diversity of people's podcast consumption. So are people becoming more or less diverse individually in terms of what they consume? If we first look at changes in that individual level diversity measure, conditional on streaming at all, we find that the individual level diversity decreased by about 10%. So this is, again, a pretty large effect, and it's showing that people are becoming less diverse in terms of what they consume. But it's unclear when you condition on streaming whether this is driven by changes in behavior or whether it's driven by selection into streaming, right? So maybe the personalized recommendations are just inducing different people to stream. When we use a technique called principal stratification to try and understand the effect of personalization on the individual level diversity of just the subset of people that always was going to stream, we still find that the treatment decreased the individual level diversity of streaming by about 10%. So the way to interpret this result is that insofar as the individual level diversity of streaming did go down, this is not just driven by changes in who is streaming, it's actually changing the behavior of people who always would have streamed. And then the final thing we're going to look at is that population level diversity measure that I mentioned earlier. And when we look at that measure, we find that the population level diversity of people's podcast streaming all increased by about 6%. So not only did people individually become more homogenous in terms of what they consumed, they also became more dissimilar from one another across the population. There's a few different things that we do in the paper to try to understand what are driving these overall effects. Thanks. I'm not going to go into all of them given time constraints, but just to show you, sort of a taste of that. One thing we can do is look at the effects of the treatment on streams that come from different parts of Spotify's app. Some of these are more algorithmically driven, while others are more human driven. And so we can sort of see whether or not, this treatment is spilling over into people's tastes, or if it's really just creating algorithmically driven effects. And what we tend to find is that the treatment does affect not only the algorithmically driven listening, but also the human driven listening. We see this across most of the outcomes that we study. So podcast streamers, podcast streams per user, individual level diversity. The one exception is that population level diversity measure that I just showed you. Just to quickly wrap up in the last minute or so that I have, just to recap the results here, this experiment is showing that increased recommendation personalization, at least in this particular experiment, increased the amount of content that people consumed, as was sort of the motivation behind the experiment. But it also increased the homogeneity of content that individual people consumed, and it also made people more dissimilar from one another. Given that paper that I mentioned early on in the talk, that shows that there are these correlations between consumption diversity and long-term business outcomes, this does suggest that there can be a sort of engagement diversity trade-off for firms that utilize these personalized recommendations. And what I mean by that is that these algorithms do optimize the short-term metric that they're sort of calibrated on, but there might be longer-term implications for the business that are not detected in these short-term field experiments. I've also shown you that exposure to personalized recommendations affected not only the recommended consumption, but also the organic human-driven consumption. And then one result we have that I didn't go into today is that we found that short-term exposure did not cause longer-term changes to consumption volume or diversity, which suggests that it is possible to maybe course correct after auditing a recommender system. Why does all this matter? I think it underscores the importance of personalization that's diversity aware. You can imagine that this fragmentation that I've sort of described might affect the content strategy of sellers or content producers in an online market or platform. Insofar as you believe that these results can be ported over to domains such as news, which you might not be comfortable doing, these patterns are consistent with the narrative that personalized recommendations can help further the creation of filter bubbles or echo chambers. And then, insofar as there is this existing literature, the study is adding more evidence to this literature and, studying a different algorithm, studying a different research context, and measuring diversity in a few different ways that I haven't been able to go into in detail during this talk. And then, the last thing I want to just sort of underline is this connection between diversity and, churn rates or monetization rates, which I think just kind of, again, underscores the importance of studying how these technological artifacts are changing the diversity of what people consume. That's what I had. Thank you so much. And looking forward to hearing people's questions and seeing talks throughout the day.